Welcome to Girl on the Gov, the podcast, breaking down politics as we know it and removing all the bullshit.
Because politics needed a rebrand.
Okay, welcome back to Girl on the podcast. Welcome to your Wednesday episode because we released a Tuesday episode yesterday and we'll be doing so moving forward. So yesterday we released our top stories episode, and so that won't be a part of this episode. We took it out of the end and put it into its own episode so you guys can get a more thorough, more explained top stories segment that has its own home now. And she was released on Tuesdays, and so now these guest interviews have some more time, and I think it's just for the best, it's the best thing for everybody.
Yeah. And wait, with that too, speaking of content, we do want to make sure you guys are checking out our Keeping Up with the Candidates feature. And that is on Instagram. Yes, IG, not TikTok, IG. Girl on the Gov, the podcast. It's where we save them. If you're new here, welcome. What this is a 10 to 15 minute interview with a candidate running for office anywhere on the ballot, up, down, sideways, whatever.
Anywhere
telling
in the
us anywhere. Wow, we going yeehaw on that one. We've had so many yeehaws in the last
liberal cowgirl
24 hours. I was gonna say it's also there's something coming on that as well, guys. So
there
stay
is
tuned.
something coming.
I'm so excited for that too. Okay, anyway, subscribe and find out. So with Keeping Up with the Candidates, we do a 10 to 15 minute interview with a candidate. We ask them the basic questions and also, of course, some of the key points in their campaign. It's a great little way to get to know a campaign really quickly, share it with friends, and get the vote out around those particular campaigns.
Even if you are listening to a candidate who isn't in your area or isn't on your ballot, if you're really inspired by them, you want to see them win, it's an important race, then again, similar to what we are saying all the time on here, is a great just action item and way to stay involved politically is to share candidates' content, because that helps them. It helps boost their audience and get in front of more people. So that's a great way to help out a campaign that you love and like. Even if you can't vote for them, then you can share their content. But yeah, so go listen to our top stories episode. It is out and ready for you to listen. We talk about Congress being back in session. They're back on their bill shit, as you might have seen on our story. It's our little catchphrase that we are obsessed with. So they're back on their bill shit. We can go learn all about kind of what they're focusing on before their other recess in August and the tetherball tournaments that they just keep having.
It makes me really miss tetherball. We had that
I
love
tetherball.
Did you have that as well?
Yeah, I had it at school. It's so fun.
You had tetherball at school. That is, that's risky business. I feel like I'm trying to think. No, none of the schools that I went to had it. I think the teachers were like, "Dear God, no."
It can get really heated and kind of dangerous, like concussion central, low key. But we also talk about Biden making moves on abortion, protecting abortion access, and protecting pregnant mothers. We also break down a big trip Biden is taking. I think he flies out tonight to the Middle East. So there's a lot on this. Hope he's packed up. Hope he's ready. Hope he's got his, hydration station. His face masks for the plane,
Who packs him though?
Oh, he's probably has a team for that.
But you know what I mean? Like, there are certain things that I just have so many questions about. Like, whose job is that? And then also, like, is that one of those jobs where you're kind of like a multi-hat? Like, do a few different things? Or is that very specific? And then
no, they probably have
a
stylists.
Job description just for that.
Yeah, they probably have stylists for the president.
I mean, I believe definitely the stylist, but who physically packs the clothing?
The stylist. Like similar to like Kim Kardashian, like they have their personal assistants and then they have their stylists and they put together their lookbook for the trip and then they pack it all up and, I think that's probably how it would work for the president, I would assume.
I love it, but if anyone's listening that has worked at the White House or just adjacent knows the answer, or that would be such a fun interview. White House stylist.
Yeah, we got to look it up, honestly. We'll do some research. But yeah, if anyone has a plug, absolutely connect us, please, because that's going to be a piece of content we'll be releasing at some point. But yeah, the other thing that's happening that we talk about a little bit in our top story segment is the January 6 hearings. The last two hearings are happening this week. We obviously are recording this when the tea hasn't been spilled yet, but the tea will be spilled by the time this episode is released. So there's that, but we'll see what the tea is.
Speaking of tea, we've got this hearing going on. We've got Jen Shah over at Bravo pleading guilty to a gazillion charges. Actually, it might not be a gazillion, but like whatever.
What are the
Small
charges?
wire fraud situation. Basically, she tried to like defraud all these elderly people. And last year, she was arrested on the show. It was this whole drama. They pulled it out for like the whole season. Not that that's not worth it, but also I'm just like not a big fan of that particular franchise. But like I had to get in on this particular tea, so I did watch it. Regardless, this is getting more attention than the January 6th hearings. And I'm like, guys, like it is equally juicy, if not juicier, because like she's just like, she's
just doing her white collar crimes that, you know, we kind of expect a housewife to commit.
Her main
but it's also
like,
crazy that like, yeah, she's probably going to get held accountable for these things, but like Trump is literally involved in an entire insurrection. And I just am not very confident that he's going to be held accountable to the extent that is needed.
That's going to be, I'm putting that on our story when we hop off. Like a would you rather, or like, no, sorry, not would you rather, like who is more likely to end up behind bars, Jen Shah or Trump?
Jen Shah.
1,000%.
Which, you know, not saying, I don't really know much about her or the situation, but, you know, justice hopefully will prevail there in the right way. But like, why isn't it for Trump? Just so annoying. And they have so much shit on him. I feel like they have a lot of white collar crime shit that is probably the same or worse than this housewife. But yet he's
it's just even crazy that like he's got as far as he did in life because of like how many people he defrauded like over time. Like what is the tea account that I found recently? It was on our story. I'm so sorry guys, but I'm blanking on what it's called. But anyways, they basically have people like submit like tea that they know about DC people. And some of it I think is really legit. Some like they go back and forth and try and see like what's valid and what's not. But regardless, they obviously have a whole thing about Trump. And most of the things that get submitted are about how he stiffed contractors every which way.
Yeah.
Every state, like notoriously known for not paying people and going after small businesses because they know it's going to be too expensive for them to sue for not getting paid. And then those companies going bankrupt.
Yeah. And yet he was
like
the
stuff
candidate
like that,
for the
like,
working class, for the blue collar boys, you know? It's looking crazy. But other thing that's crazy that's come out, I believe today or yesterday, was that there's a poll New York Times did, by the way, which is like a liberal news organization, that came out with this poll that 64% of Democrats, not even including like independents or even total voters and conservatives, want somebody other than Joe Biden to represent the Democratic Party in 2024. So that's a crazy fucking number.
Me.
It doesn't like in this situation, but it does when you look at just like history. Like an incumbent does not lose this bad. Like this is bad.
What is this, like Jimmy Carter status?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. But
I wonder what those numbers are.
Usually it's the, you know, I guess like Trump, that's why Trump's loss was so crazy, is because like even though a lot of people didn't like him, like the president in power is usually always wins the second term. And so it's just crazy that there might be a shift here happening just across the board that like, no, like if we don't like you, like you're out. One of the biggest concerns in that poll was like the age.
Which I think is so fair.
Which is totally fair. Totally fair. And there's definitely things on his docket that he's done good that he's not getting the acknowledgement for. And then the other thing that like we kind of talk about too in the top stories, like things like gas prices and stuff like that is always thrown on the president, but it's so much bigger than that. And it really comes down to this like the corporate greed and everything. But like there's so much that happens in the world that's just like blamed on the president that has nothing to do with them. Yeah. And the fact that we just went through like a global pandemic and now like a recession is looming, and it's like that's not Biden's fault. Like that's also a global recession that's looming. It's not just an American one. So it's just like there's so much that's poured onto the president that's not completely accurate. But at the same time, I would also like to see some fresh blood in the White House. And there are some great options. A woman for sure.
Yeah. Well, there's some does integrated in that. Like I've definitely got a small circle in mind that I'd be like, like Stacey Abrams. I'm looking directly at you.
Directly.
But like she's definitely not the only one I'm thinking of, but I haven't come to a distinct conclusion is all I can say.
There's just like a lot about 2024 I'm really excited to see. I'm really scared, but I'm excited at the same time. It's so interesting.
But we need to use that right now as a reminder that what happens in 2022, aka these midterm elections, is going to largely dictate what happens in 2024.
Largely.
So if you're listening to us and you're like, oh my gosh, yeah, me too, I'm excited, and you're gonna like sit out this election, or you know friends that are going to too, no, you're gonna go to girlonthegov.com/vote and you're gonna check your registration. You're gonna send it to your friends. You're gonna make sure you're registered to vote. Make sure everyone you know. I mean,
and
dogs don't count, so don't try and do that. You might know a dog, but don't register a dog.
Biggie deserves a vote more than a lot of people.
Yeah. And Howard.
And Howard and Smalls, of course.
Doing God's woof work.
I know. They deserve a voice, you know? Like, you know, having the streets paved and, you know, the park rules, like, affect their lives. Like, why don't they have a say? So, but yes, go register to vote, check your registration, send it to your friends, and pledge to vote. You can do that on our website at girlonthegov.com/vote. And then the other thing I just wanted to address before we get into our episode with this guest is the pregnant woman who cited the row reversal to fight a carpool lane ticket, saying that her fetus counts as a passenger. And while this is just like iconic in a headline alone, it's actually really interesting to think about, and how like there's a lot of just shit that like can backfire with this row reversal of having fetuses count as people. But like people filing fetuses as like dependents on their tax return, like you never know. Like they should. And I think there's a lot that can be done here. We'll start brainstorming of other ways to use this strategy that this brave, iconic woman in Texas did.
Icon.
But don't forget to sign up for our brand ambassador program. There's no requirements. There's resume boosters, political networking opportunities, and just a community of like-minded political women who want to continue the conversation and have impact. So you can go sign up at girlonthegov.com and go to our brand ambassador page and learn all about it. You can sign up as well. And yeah, it's pretty easy. And you can just slide on in and join the community. There's a lot of exciting stuff happening.
Subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts. Apple.
Apple?
Wow, it really came out. Apple. Anyways, subscribe, rate, review. It really helps us grow, so we really appreciate it. Spotify, make sure you're following us there. We know a lot of you guys love Apple, but we want to make sure Spotify gets some love too, so don't forget about it. YouTube, you get to see our faces. Well, you really get to see me having incredibly bad ADHD and Maddie actually sitting still for like the entire episode. So if you want to just like check it out, subscribe, whatnot, head on over there. And, of course, follow us on both of our Instagrams, Girl on the Gov, so one with all the action items, Girl on the Gov, the podcast, one with our faces and commentary and all the guests. So you get 2-for-1 kind of situation. TikTok, Girl on the Gov as well. Girlonthegov.com/vote. When you want to register to vote, check your registration, pledge to vote, request absentee ballot. And I do want to give a shout out to one of my favorite brands, aka one of our favorite brands, which is an overnight oats company that I literally found on an Instagram deep dive and then I'm obsessed with, and it's called Spoonful. Anyways, they gave us a really awesome code for 20% off your order. So Girl and Gov, all caps, when you check out, and that gives you 20% off. And FYI, my favorite flavor is the cinnamon apple one. So you definitely want to go and match with me because twinsies.
I love overnight oats, and I still need to get an order of Spoonful, but I make overnight oats almost every day at home. But I would love to try some other flavors because mine's pretty basic. But yeah, go get your overnight oats.
Like one of those things where I feel like sometimes the sugar ratio is just like so off, like it's too sweet or it's too dry, and then they just get it right. Get it fucking right. And the branding's really cute too. So
I know when I make it, I always like make it too dry, but I just like pour more coconut milk in mine to like make it all nice and the right texture.
Yeah.
But, like it's really hard to actually get the right ratio. Yeah, with the milk. So, but anyways, that aside, we'll get into our episode. We have a repeat guest, Kevin on. Samantha,
Woo.
do you want to give him his intro?
I am honored to do so. So, you guys might recall Ben Sheehan. He is a former award-winning executive producer at Funny or Die. He also founded OMG WTF and has a really great book on, you guessed it, the Constitution. How it works, it's spoken in, I don't know, not English from a gazillion years ago. It's made super easy to understand and breaks everything down. So, we actually had him on the show.
Kids.
Oh my God, yes.
There's
So
one
if you
for
have
kids,
any
if you have
little
kids.
ones, or maybe you're about to be a godparent, or I don't
an
know,
auntie.
all the things. All the things. There's some little
Get
kid
the
that is
civic
adjacent
learning
to your
going
life,
early. We love it.
in your life. Exactly. But for this episode, we talk with Ben about something very important, and that is Moore versus Harper, which is a case that the Supreme Court just decided to take up for next session, and it is dealing with elections, specifically presidential elections, and so much more. So we get into it. I'm not going to steal the thunder. I'm not. I'm going to let you hear the explanation from Ben because it's just so much better than I could ever do. It's hilarious, and it's also just freaking spot on. So join us, listen to it, share with a friend, and without further ado, here is Ben.
All right, well, we are so excited to have you back. Loved episode 1. So also for anyone listening, episode 1, go check it out. Like, why have you not listened to it yet? This is a great moment to get some.
episode too.
It is most evergreen, not to like pull out a word from PR 101, but evergreen topics ever, aka understanding, I don't know, the Constitution, which is every person's argument for everything, right and wrong. So just those basics, just a few things there. But nonetheless, we're going to jump right in because we have so much to talk about, so much to define. And one of those things is independent state legislature. I literally can never say that word. Legislature. There we go. Okay, I finally got the ending on that. Theory. What on earth is that?
We'll just get right into it.
I'll jump right in. So it's an idea that is actually pretty new. It stems from a 2000 court case, famous one, Bush v. Gore. And in his opinion, William Rehnquist, who was the Chief Justice at the time, kind of made this throwaway, like in passing reference to, well, state courts don't have as much power as state legislatures when it comes to election laws, because the Constitution says specifically state legislatures in Article 1, Section 4. And this didn't really get a lot of pickup at the time. And then 15 years later, there was a case in Arizona over Arizona's redistricting commission for redrawing the congressional lines. And the argument was that there couldn't be an independent redistricting commission because the Constitution doesn't mention that specifically. It just says state legislature. And then again, in 2020, there were in Pennsylvania over the contest, or I should say the controversy. The Republican Party in Pennsylvania was mad that the Republican or the Democratic Secretary of State extended the deadlines for, I think, mail-in ballots or by a couple days due to COVID. And the argument was, well, she doesn't have the power to do that because she's not a legislature. So it's really only 3 times or so in the last 20 years, but it's become this, I'll say radical, idea of a very literal interpretation from 2 parts of the Constitution that mention the word legislature. So the debate is really over, does the word legislature in the Constitution just mean that singular branch of government can act completely as it wants when it comes to setting rules for federal elections, or does a state's constitution and their governor and their courts also apply?
That is really interesting, especially because it's like, well, if like those don't matter, like what's the point of even having them, right? It's like kind of the question of like, is it just a show? Like, is this a stage with some political theater? We've just built these systems for like no reason. I guess
Very
the question
confusing.
too becomes like, yeah, like so confusing. I mean, I feel like that's a lot of things like constitutional where everyone sort of has like a opinion and interpretation. There's always something to it. But is there a specific person, entity that's really like grabbed onto this theory and be like, this is what we think, this is the vibe, like we're rolling with it?
Well,
And
I'll
also,
put
sorry,
it
can we also get some color context as to like really what we're seeing right now and like why we're even talking about this, you know?
Sure.
That's
So
fair.
there's a case that the Supreme Court has decided to hear called Moore versus Harper, which is over in North Carolina. The the district lines were struck down by the state's courts as unfair. And the person suing is the Speaker of the House of Representatives in North Carolina, saying, well, the court shouldn't have any say because the Constitution specifically says the legislature gets to decide the times, places, and manner of elections for representatives. So it doesn't say the state courts, it doesn't say the governor, it doesn't say a state's constitution, it just says the legislature. And again, this is kind of, it's almost like comical. It's like a comical, literal reading into something, because for hundreds of years, it wasn't controversial that a state court could strike down a map, or a governor could veto a map, or a state legislature had to follow its own constitution. The Constitution is very short. It's less than 8,000 words. There's not a ton. I mean, it's dense, but there's not, everything isn't in there. Yeah. So there's plenty of things that I think the people who wrote it just assumed would apply, like a state having, checks and balances, like the federal government has checks and balances, and state, legislatures and governors and courts having to follow their own state constitution. This was very uncontroversial for a
they're
long
like,
time.
nobody would misinterpret this. We'll just keep it vague.
Right. But as we've seen, if you don't specifically, over the last couple of years specifically, if you don't exactly write down what you mean, people can use it for their own gain.
Right.
And that's really what you're seeing, is you're seeing people who are jumping on this sort of extreme version of an interpretation of the Constitution to try to gerrymander maps. And by what this would also do, wouldn't just allow state legislatures to gerrymander maps, unfettered. It would also basically say that state legislatures have full reign over all federal elections. So all elections for the House, for the Senate, and for president. And that includes being able to ignore the people's vote for president in a state and pass a law saying, well, if there's fraud, then, we, the state legislators, are going to decide who gets which electors get to vote. Or, we can take back the power to choose the electors ourselves at any time, and you don't get to vote for president, which I guess brings me to a fact that maybe some of your listeners, or many people, may not know, is that we don't have the constitutional right to vote for president. We only get to do it because our state legislature lets us. And for 100 years, for the first 100 years of the country, in a number of states, people didn't vote for president. The state legislature just chose the electors, and the electors voted for president. So it's only been since 1880 that every state has had a popular vote in the state as a way to choose the electors. So we don't have the constitutional right to vote for president. That actually was reiterated in Bush v. Gore. So we've all sort of assumed we have this right that we don't have. And if Moore v. Harper gets decided in a certain way that upholds the state legislature theory, that will be a very rude awakening for a lot of people, because state legislatures would just be able to pick electors themselves, ignoring their own state constitution, ignoring the other branches in their state government.
Wow. Well, rude awakenings have been happening a lot lately, and hopefully people are going to be more proactive. I don't know what we could hope. But speaking of all of this, does this spark a constitutional crisis? And on that conversation, can you also explain really what a constitutional crisis is, and what is it? Help.
SOS.
Sure. SOS. So, I mean, it feels like every day we open our phone and look at Twitter or look at the news and see something about a constitutional crisis. It feels like one of those words that's thrown around all the time. But it does feel like a boy that cried wolf situation, where this actually would be a crisis, because it would completely upend how we've thought of elections for hundreds of years. Yeah. A constitutional crisis is basically a debate over something that is unclear in the Constitution. It's not specifically said, or the interpretation is unclear, and it's never happened before, and so we don't know how it would go, how this would unfold. So, there have been constitutional crises in our history. It's not the first time this has happened. In 1876, the presidential election was down to the wire, and there were the guy winning was up by 19 electoral votes, and there were 3 states that were delayed, and there were controversies over the votes in those states, and then all the electors came in and went to the basically went to the other guy, and he won by 1 electoral vote. And
Wow.
the loser was a guy named Samuel Tilden. His supporters threw a shit show, and they threatened to like have a parallel inauguration and ignore somebody like went and shot at the guy who won was Rutherford B. Hayes. Somebody went and shot at his house in Ohio, tried to assassinate him. They threatened to have literally parallel inaugurations on March 4th, which was the old inauguration day. And so it was a constitutional crisis. And so this group of 15 representatives, senators, and Supreme Court justices ended up giving the votes to Rutherford B. Hayes, sadly in exchange for his promising to remove federal troops from the South. And that was basically the touching off the era of Jim Crow and the end of Reconstruction. But that's an example of something that they didn't know how to handle. And so they ended up passing this law 10 years later called the Electoral Count Act that was supposed to clearly say what happens if multiple slates of electors come in from a state, which is the legitimate one, or what happens if a state is late in delivering their electors. How should Congress count them? And the irony is that that law itself is very unclear and hard to interpret, and it contains a paragraph that's like 300 words long that people have varying interpretations of. So the law that was passed to solve a constitutional crisis is now creating a constitutional crisis of its own. So, and that's what the debate was, on January 6th was, does the vice president in this law have the power to throw out electoral votes? Almost everyone said no. They just sort of oversee the counting. Like the job's already been finished by the states. But
Yeah.
it's a long way of saying that a constitutional crisis has happened before. It's basically what happens when something is unclear in the Constitution. No one's really sure how it is supposed to go.
In question to that, so like, say we get to the result of like Moore v. Harper, and it's not exactly going in our favor, and it sparks this like constitutional crisis. Who resolves that? Like, are there specific branches of government, specific people? Like I know you were just saying like Supreme Court and some legislators came together and came up with sort of like a law and also what seems like a compromise, if you will. Like, who would be spearheading that? And then does anyone then oversee the spearheaders of that, for lack of better terms?
Well, I don't know if the sad thing is I don't know if it would necessarily spark a constitutional crisis, because if the Supreme Court's job is to interpret the Constitution, right? That's literally their job. They get to review things and say, well, this Constitution recognizes these rights, it doesn't recognize these rights. This is what it actually says. So they're the grand interpreters of the Constitution. If they look at it and say, we've thought about this and we've had some cases that have tangentially touched on this idea, but we really believe that it specifically says in Article 2, Section 1, the legislature gets to decide how electors are appointed, and in Article 1, Section 4, it says the state's legislature gets to decide the times, places, and manner of our elections. So we think that means the independent state, the body itself, the branch of government, and not the Constitution, not the governor, not the courts. And if it does that, then there's not a lot anyone can do. That means that basically gives state legislatures, when it comes to making laws on things that aren't federal elections, yeah, they're still bound by, the governor can veto it, the state courts can strike it down, the state constitution has to be followed, but they're using this little loophole of the fact that only the word legislature is mentioned in these two parts of the Constitution, so it means that this branch can operate independently of anything else in each state. So that would, I don't know if it would spark a constitutional crisis, because it's pretty clear what would happen is that states would be able to have this incredible power, this unchecked power in this one specific area. And it means that elections for president, it means that election rules in each state are now entirely dependent on a legislature, which, we're dancing around the sad reality, but in most states is gerrymandered.
Right.
It's not reflective of the people. The people who are holding these positions have drawn the lines so that the voters are almost always going to re-elect them just by nature of how many people from each party are in the district. So you're talking about people who are, rigging up the playing field for elections that have already rigged the playing field for their own election.
Yeah.
So it's a way to hold on to power when you feel like your back is up against the wall. And that's what's happening is you see, the demographics of this country are changing, and they're changing quickly. And people who are currently in power feel like they are losing that power, and they want to maintain that power. And this is one extension of that.
Yeah. Can you also paint a picture too of really Morby Harper and who's kind of behind it and like the politics of it, and also just kind of like, if this were to be overturned, some scenarios that could play out, and again, like who that would ultimately favor, just so people can like understand.
So right now, the state of North Carolina is a split government, right? So you have a Democratic governor and you have a Republican legislature. Mm-hmm. And the Speaker of the House is a guy named Tim Moore, the Speaker of the House of North Carolina. And the state legislature is responsible for drawing the district lines for congressional elections in the vast majority of states. So what happened was they drew these lines, and the courts in North Carolina said, well, these are unfair. These are horribly gerrymandered, and you can't gerrymander based on race. But the Supreme Court said it's not up to the Supreme Court to decide whether or not you can gerrymander a political party. The Constitution doesn't mention any of that, so it's up to each state. So the state courts in North Carolina basically said, hey, we're striking down these maps. These are unfair. And the legislature said, well, you don't have the power to strike down the maps. Even if the North Carolina state constitution implies that you have that power, you don't, according to the U.S. Constitution. And so they filed a lawsuit saying that the striking down the maps is not okay because the U.S. Constitution doesn't say anything about, state courts having that ability. So that is the case that is being decided by the Supreme Court. And even though it's specifically a gerrymandering case, if it ruled that legislatures have the power, unchecked and independent, to regulate federal elections, then that also applies to presidential elections, because the same, wording in the Constitution for congressional elections is the same for presidential. It says the state legislature. So that's the reality of it. So even though it's a gerrymandering case specific to a single state, how it gets decided if the court upholds this independent state. It's the same thing for what has happened with the gun case in New York, right? It's like that case had to do specifically with New York's own laws, but California has similar laws, Maryland has similar laws, and you see a domino effect where that law was struck down as unconstitutional. And so now I was just at my town hall, my city council here in Pasadena, and the chief of police got up there and was like, look, thanks to the Supreme Court, last year in this county, we had 3,300 applications granted for concealed carry permits. Now, because our laws have to be weaker, it used to be that you had to justify a reason to have a concealed carry permit, and the state could deny it if they didn't think it was a good enough reason. Yeah. Now that that's unconstitutional, it's going to spike, and we're expecting over 50,000 concealed carry permits in a single year.
Oh my gosh.
So, again, that Supreme Court case had to do with New York, but the decision applies to all states. And so this case has to do with North Carolina, but the decision that could be rendered would have an impact for every state legislature.
Crazy.
Fun.
Some comments. One being, look, there's lots of things I would say we would need to do if we all time traveled, but one would be just to tell the founding fathers, like, maybe there's nothing common about common sense. I'm just putting it out there. One of the many bullet points to just let them know about. Otherwise, I do have another question, which isn't even a comment, obviously. What the hell is the point of the popular vote? Like, I just, like, through this conversation, like, that's just what keeps coming to mind is, like, what the hell is the point of it if we end up in these situations?
Well, there is no point of a national popular vote. It's the popular vote in each state. And that's how every state says, okay, we are going to appoint the electors, and whichever, we're going to have a popular vote and let the people in our state decide, and however they vote, that person's party's electors are going to vote. And that's how it's been done in every state since 1880. But the national popular vote means nothing. I mean, it gives you an indication of how many people favor a particular candidate in the country, but it has no value. It has no constitutional application. We have this electoral college system, and it's the popular vote in each state that matters. Also, as a side note, not every state requires electors to vote how the popular vote went. It's actually more than, it's like 2/3 of states.
Crazy.
You don't have to vote how the people in your state voted if you're an elector. And in half of those states, it's like 17 states have absolutely no laws whatsoever, so you can vote a different way and nothing would happen. And then in another 17 states or so, they have a law saying you have to follow it, but there's no penalty if you break it. It's really stupid. But also, the people who are electors are usually like, they're screened, but they're pre-screened by the party. They're pre-screened by the state party. And so it's very, it's like, if it's Trump electors, it's like they're Trump enthusiasts. They've been like vetted by the party. There have been people who are active in Republican politics for years, and same thing on the Democratic side. So the odds of somebody who's like been vetted by a state party, spent their life working in that party, suddenly having a change of heart. I mean, it's possible. We've had faithless electors before, but it's only like 160 something, and they've never changed the outcome of an election. So it's rare, and it's never had like consequence. But it is technically possible. So there's a long way of saying the answer is the national popular vote. There is nothing. It doesn't mean anything as of now, at least.
It's a good polling system.
Yeah, it's a way to get people to like pay attention. It's a poll. That's basically what it is.
Totally. Well, we have Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court, whose wife literally participated in the insurrection. No big deal. Obviously, he's not the only one to worry about, but we have someone who's married to an insurrectionist, deciding this case. So, I don't know.
Your question is how do you think he's going to impact the decision? Well, keep in mind that whenever the Supreme Court hears a case, you have to have 4 justices vote to hear it. So in the past, maybe there have been cases that haven't had the full support of 4 justices to hear it, but this one did. And I think that's a reflection of who's on the Supreme Court now. Clarence Thomas was in 2000, supported this idea of sort of independent state legislatures, and he supported it again in 2015 and in 2020. So he's been, on this train for a while. But I think it's pretty obvious how he's going to vote. He's told us how he's going to vote. Right. The question is, what are the other justices going to do? And I think there's a pretty good indication that Samuel Alito will also support this independent state legislature theory. I think there's a very good chance that Neil Gorsuch also supports the independent state legislature theory because they've basically told us that they already support it. Brett Kavanaugh probably, I don't know, but likely the swing vote would be Amy Coney Barrett.
That's wild.
I'm guessing because John Roberts hasn't endorsed this specifically, and I don't think that he would go along with it. My own personal opinion, but I do think that the deciding vote would be Amy Coney Barrett because she hasn't gone on the record and said what she thinks.
They seem to be all good buddies, though.
Buddy.
Well,
they pray together.
They do pray together. That's right. You never know. Like, are there times where justices have surprised me? Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't have seen, Neil Gorsuch being the author of the opinion, protecting trans people from being, fired at work. That wouldn't have been the top. He wouldn't be the justice that came to mind first. I'm glad he did. I mean, he said he was, he's definitely been a little bit more independent. He's very conservative. But he's definitely had a couple examples where he's been a little bit more independent-minded. But he's pretty clear on this case where he stands. So you never know. I definitely don't think it bodes well. I think that it's certainly my guess would be a 5-4 decision in favor of this. But the question is, would they fully embrace the independent state legislature theory? Would there be caveats? Is there a chance the person who filed the case could drop it? Probably not at this point. He's kind of a true believer. He's a longtime state representative in North Carolina. He's now the Speaker of the North Carolina House. He's got higher political aspirations. I think he sees this as like his, calling card, notch on his belt for higher office and street cred. So I'm pretty worried. I got to be honest with you that, 5 people could throw out, centuries of presidential and congressional election precedent and just let a single branch of government be totally unfettered. But we have to plan for that. And it's not, that's not even like a conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican thing. Like, there are plenty of conservative scholars who have thought this idea was stupid for many, many years. Like, this is a pretty recent, almost comically literal interpretation of the word legislature. And I think we have to do as much education as possible, letting people know like what is actually at stake, and also giving people action items, because here's the thing. Almost every single state legislature is on the ballot this year. Almost every single state legislator. That's 89% of all state legislative chambers. So 88 of our 99 state legislative chambers, because Nebraska only has one. They're the lone state with they just have a Senate. They don't have a House. So there's 99 state legislative. They're doing their own thing. I think it's cool. Yeah, and they also have a different way of appointing the electors. It's like the winner of the state gets 2 electors to the 2 senators, and then the winner of each congressional district gets 1. That's how Maine does it. So Nebraska's kind of doing its own thing, which is cool. But I do think that there has to be a mass education of what this case means, and a mass understanding that this year is the last chance to make changes, because the people who are elected to state legislatures across the country, 84% of all individual state legislators are on the ballot this year. Those are the people who suddenly in a year could have the power to completely change how elections are run in their state. And so, you're going to be fighting uphill in a lot of states. You're fighting gerrymandered legislatures, but also these are races that very few people pay attention to.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I have a different way to take this really fast. I'm just super curious, your thoughts about really what's been happening in the Supreme Court. Obviously, there's been more, from Roe and on in recent weeks of just kind of some insane, not only rulings, but also just kind of conversations coming out of the Supreme Court of, their plans. And I'm just curious of what your thoughts, what's going on, what's going on in the Supreme Court, and has this been decades of work that's finally coming to fruition of kind of a almost conservative attack on certain rights and the way we see democracy? What are really your thoughts? It could be even your personal opinions of what you see going on, but what do you think is happening?
Well, to be honest, and not to give Donald Trump any credit, but he said he was going to appoint conservative justices to overturn Roe v. Wade, and he did. And he said he was going to put conservatives on the Supreme Court who would be very, very conservative in their rulings, and he did. And I think a lot of people, who, and I'm not sitting here to place blame, but anyone in, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin who went, I don't really like Hillary Clinton, she's, she doesn't excite me, and I'm just going to stay home. You kind of did this. You kind of did. Fact. Because this is all, it's not obvious the consequences of our elections immediately. And with him winning the presidency, he got to appoint 3 justices. And that fundamentally changed the balance of the court, not just temporarily, but for a long time. These are not old people that are going to die soon. These are young, youngish, by Supreme Court justice standards, youngish people who will be on the court a long time, and you fundamentally change the balance of the court. And again, we talk a lot about how justices are going to rule, but having people on the court fundamentally changes what cases the court takes up. So now that you have 4 justices who are in lockstep and can choose
who Trump
these
chose.
Cases. Right.
That's who,
3
the fact that it's Trump chose these people should be scary enough, that
right.
Who knows?
So you just need one justice, assuming they're all going to vote in lockstep, which they don't always, by the way. You look at the numbers and there is definitely more disagreement among Supreme Court justices.
This specific court?
This specific court. There are a lot of times, it's only, if you want to get technical about it, it's only been 13% of cases in the last term that was a 6-3 partisan divide. But what 13% of those cases?
Yeah, and I also feel like this court is really feeling like an unprecedented court too.
Well, this one, yeah, this particular term, I think someone, I don't remember who, but there was an article I was reading that did a evaluation of how this Supreme Court stands, and it's the most conservative term in 100-something years.
Yeah.
I mean,
And
it's
as
really,
a body
really,
that's supposed to be kind of, the non-political body, it just seems like
Right.
they have such an agenda that
Right.
Wait, also speaking of like that agenda and them being on, the bench for literal like time immemorial, so like Botox doesn't even help anymore. Like, what are your thoughts on term limits? I know that there's a rep from California that's introduced legislation previously, 2021, but obviously could still be taken up in the House in terms of it's an 18-year term limit. Like, do you think that has any legs to it? Also, 18 years still
Which
feels
is
like a
pretty absurd.
really long time. Like, that's like literally
Yeah.
like how long you're paying child support for if you have a kid. Like, why is that? I think of things like that, or like, is it how many Chipotles is it? So this is how I do my math. But I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
On what I think of child support for Supreme Court justices, I feel like let's see. I do think I think the question there is whether or not that's constitutional. Can there be a limit on Supreme Court justice terms without amending the Constitution? And some people say no, and some people say yes, because it doesn't specifically say that Supreme Court justices have to serve for life in the Constitution. It says justices for the federal courts, the Supreme Court for lower courts will have their jobs during good behavior. And what is good behavior? They don't really specify what that means. What effectively means is either, you could get impeached and removed by, impeached by the House, removed by the Senate, which has never happened to a Supreme Court justice. We've only impeached one Supreme Court justice ever, and that was, Samuel Chase in like 1805 or something like that.
Oh, what did he do?
It's like corruption, something that would probably be kind of quaint. I mean, I don't know this. I should say I'm pretty sure it was a corruption case. I don't know the specifics of it, but I do know that we've only impeached one Supreme Court justice, and it was a very long time ago. So to expect Congress to act as a check on justice behavior, I think is being very naive. We have impeached justices before, just not Supreme Court justices. We've impeached and removed several federal judges at the district and the circuit court level. I think the last one was in 2010, and that was a corruption one too. I don't think that the Supreme Court is going to be held accountable by Congress. So, or what Congress could do, short of impeaching or removing a justice, is they could pass a law to say we're going to have 18-year terms for the Supreme Court, and then the person isn't going to lose their job. So they're keeping their job during good behavior, but they're just going to move down to the circuit level, and we'll bring somebody up from the circuit level, the district level, or whoever, the president will appoint somebody new, but you kind of like cycle through. So you're technically keeping your job, but you're just not on the Supreme Court for your entire
That seems
life.
fair. That seems fair.
And again, 18 years is a long time, but the whole point of this, the whole reason we have lifetime appointments is because it was supposed to be like the independent, nonpartisan branch. This was the branch that was not elected by people. They're not, beholden to running for office every few years. They're, they're not concerned with whatever the popular sentiment is of the day. Their only allegiance is to interpreting and upholding the Constitution and interpreting federal laws. And that's the intent. So whether or not that is how it's functioning today is definitely a matter of debate.
Do we think it's also is like the life expectancy was so low that they weren't so worried? They're like, you kick the can in 5 years. Have a great appointment. It's fine.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I don't know any like scholarship offhand that said, we're giving people lifetime terms because we don't live that long. But I think that's a fair point, is that they didn't expect people to live to be, in their 90s.
That's true.
At least back then, that would be
Something to think
an
about.
anomaly.
Yeah,
totally. Well, I think that's a really big flag of like, don't bring me to a funeral, because I'll be like, they kicked the can. So in case anyone needed someone to go to a funeral with, do not invite me. I'm a disaster. Anyways, moving right along.
I didn't know people get like +1s to funerals. Have I been sleeping on this guest opportunity?
Such an interesting personality trait, Samantha.
So
Sounds like therapy
anyways
is needed.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Anyone has a gift card for any therapy.coms, LMK. But moving on to things that we can change right now, which is action items, things to look ahead for. What do you recommend? How can people try and like bring this down a notch, or at least prepare for what might happen?
I really think the only, you have to prepare for the worst. And I think to the point that you guys brought up a little bit earlier, that, this overturning Roe v. Wade didn't happen overnight. This was a 49-year concerted effort by a group of people that were meticulous, well-planned, well-organized, good coordination in, you could say, well, it's a lot of people that are homogenous, and so it's easy for them to be, lockstep. But there is a level of organization that I think exists on the right that doesn't exist on the left in terms of an allegiance to the long game. I think there's an understanding of how change happens and that it doesn't it doesn't happen immediately. And I think the left is more diverse in factions. Like, there are factions within the conservative movement, the Republican Party, don't get me wrong, and there are issues and rifts between them. But I would say overall, the Democratic Party, the left, is more disjointed, is more fractured. It's more of a group of different people with different goals, and there's less organization, effective organization across those groups over an extended period of time.
I totally agree.
And there has to, it's not just getting people elected. It's also changing public opinion and investing in think tanks and wings of universities and putting out studies and using, obviously I'm tiptoeing around a big one, but like using religion and using religious leaders to talk about this. Abortion isn't mentioned in the Constitution. Some people say, well, in the Constitution, well, it's not mentioned in the Constitution. It's not mentioned in the Bible either, at least by name. And, it's become this giant religious issue. So like, what's really going on here? And I have my own thoughts, but the point is that I'm trying to make is that there's a level of playing the long game, organization over the course of decades to achieve an end goal. And as we've seen, that works.
I totally agree.
That works really well.
I've been thinking about this too, because I see a lot of people too frustrated at, the people saying, well, just vote. And like, I totally get that, because like just having people say, just go vote is like, okay, well, there's still mass shootings happening every day. Like, we need immediate action, and I totally get that. But people are kind of frustrated at the just vote thing. But it goes back to even your point of like, those who didn't vote back in 2016, like that's why this is happening now. And I think totally there's such a disconnect from the left of understanding that long game, and we talk about that all the time. But also we talk about the like marketing of the Democrats on the left side and how bad it is, be it using religious organizations or connecting with young people better. Like, there's so much work to be done on all of that. The Democrats' messaging is not the best. So I think we're seeing a lot of that come to fruition now. But
I think I think the Democrat, or I guess I'm not even going to say political party. I think it has to do with younger generations, and I'm including myself in that. I'm a millennial, barely, but I am. And I feel like we didn't get civic education the same way that our parents and maybe older siblings did. And as part of that, it's not always a direct cause and effect. It's not like you vote for this person, this immediately happens. Like, there are steps in between. It's like you vote for this person can do this, they can hire this person, and then that person does this. There's like a couple steps in between. It's like an A to E or whatever. It's like we all expect it to be an A to B. It's like there's steps that happen in between. You're giving power to somebody, they're passing that power along. That person has the power to do something, and then that has the power. So like, not voting for, even if you don't like maybe you didn't like Hillary, and that's fine, but like, if you liked having the right to have an abortion, like that was what was on the ballot. So by not voting for that person, you're giving the power to appoint Supreme Court justices to somebody else. By not by not showing up to vote in your Senate elections, that's changing the balance of the Senate, and that is the body that confirms Supreme Court justices. So if that opportunity, so it's like you have to think, a couple steps ahead of, it's not just an immediate response to your vote. It's, where does this, who am I giving what power to?
Totally. But we do want to wrap up with just any other kind of like what happens next, what voters can do. Like, we're in this election year. What are some, I guess, action items moving forward that we touched on earlier, but we can really hammer home before we go?
So I'm all about telling people to vote, but being really specific when doing it, not just show up and vote, but like, here's who you need to vote for. You need to pay attention. So I'm going to do it in the context of Moore v. Harper. And by the way, the same people that are going to have the power potentially to ignore your vote for president and do whatever they want are the same people that make abortion laws for you. And they're also the same people who make gun laws for you. And those are your state legislators. And if you don't know who your state legislators are, go to openstates.org and put in your address, and you will find your 2 state legislators. Now, sometimes you may have more than one because some states use multi-member districts. So it's not just you live in a district and you have one representative for that district. In my original home state of Maryland, you live in a district, but you have multiple members in the state house. So multi-member districts. So you might have more than one. Or if you live in Nebraska, you only have one. You've got one state senator and that's it. But go to openstates.org, put in your address, find out who these people are, follow them on social media, take down their contact info, know exactly where they stand on these issues, specifically guns, abortion, and, allowing people, not state legislators, to choose the president. Know exactly where they stand and vote accordingly. And if you live in states that have really closely divided legislatures, some legislatures are very closely divided. One that's going to be very hotly watched this year is Michigan, because Michigan is for the first time using a map that is not gerrymandered, is fairly drawn because they have a brand new independent redistricting commission that passed in 2018 that is now going into effect for the first time for these races. So Michigan legislature is very closely divided. It could flip from Republican to Democrat. I think it's the Minnesota Senate is very closely divided. That could flip. Arizona, even though the map is gerrymandered, there's only 1 seat advantage for Republicans in both chambers. So it's like a one seat would make the difference in the House and the Senate in Arizona. So really the swing states, pay attention to those. If you don't live in a state that has a particularly competitive legislative race, you can just get involved in a different state's legislative race. Pick a state that could use your help, like a Michigan, like a Minnesota, like Arizona, like a Nevada. I mean, there are a lot of states that are going to end up making the difference, and your last chance to elect these people, I can't stress it enough, is this year. Yeah. Whoever gets elected to this office this year, that is who's going to have the power to do whatever the Supreme Court ends up allowing them to do. Yeah. And you can't make any more changes after November 2022. That's it. Once they take office, that's who has that power. So these are offices that we always call down ballot, and I hate that term because it implies that they're less powerful when they're actually, in my opinion, more powerful because they have more of a direct impact on your life because they're closer to your front door.
Mm-hmm, totally. Amazing advice. Thank you very much. And thank you for answering all of our questions. We have 100,000 more for you, but we'll cap it here. But thank you again. Thanks for coming on. And again, everyone listening, go listen to the first Benchian episode because
obviously,
it's also very important.
In the description. So don't worry, you don't have to scroll. We'll link it, yada, yada, yada. But also a reminder, where can everyone find you and all of your amazing explainer videos and all that jazz?
It just at my name on Instagram, so at Ben Sheehan, and at that Ben Sheehan on TikTok and Twitter. I don't really use Twitter anymore. I feel like it's just a bunch of bots fighting with each other. So I really spend most of my time on.
We deleted ours too.
On TikTok and Instagram. I find those to be the most personable and interesting platforms. So find me there.
Love it. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.